Standard 3C has to do with suitability. There are two aspects here. One aspect is where you are involved in an advisory relationship with your client. The other aspect is where you might be responsible for managing a portfolio to a particular mandate or strategy. Let's consider the advisory relationship scenario first. When members and candidates are in an advisory relationship with the client, they must do the following. A. Make a reasonable inquiry into a client's or prospective client's investment experience, risk and return objectives, and financial constraints prior to making any investment recommendations or taking investment action, and must reassess and update this information regularly. We'll see this material in detail when we cover portfolio management, but simplistically the idea is that an investment advisor must understand the client's risk and return objectives, the client's knowledge of financial markets, and based on the client's situation, the investment manager or the investment advisor should develop an investment policy. The client might be an individual or the client might be an institution, but regardless of the exact nature of the client, an investment policy must be created. Obviously, what is contained in the investment policy will depend on the client, but very simplistically, the investment policy will outline what sort of investments are appropriate for the client. Item B. Determine that an investment is suitable to the client's financial situation and consistent with the client's written objectives, mandates, and constraints before making an investment recommendation or taking investment action. This is fairly self-evident. Obviously, if the client is very risk averse, then the investments that need to be made have to be relatively low risk investments. Another point made over here is that the client's situation might change, or that is implied over here, because of which the investment policy statement should be reviewed periodically and updated. The updates could happen based on changes in the client's situation. The updates might also happen based on changes in the financial market expectations. Point C is that we need to judge the suitability of investments in the context of the client's total portfolio. And this combines with the need for diversification. As discussed in an earlier standard, the diversification perspective needs to be kept in mind when we advise a client. And also, when a new investment is evaluated, it needs to be evaluated in a portfolio context. Coming now to the other dimension, when members and candidates are responsible for managing a portfolio to a specific mandate, strategy, or style, they must make only investment recommendations or take only investment actions that are consistent with the stated objectives and constraints of the portfolio. Let's say that you are a portfolio manager and you are managing a fund which consists of small cap stocks. Now, your mandate is that you are only allowed to invest in stocks in a particular region where the market capitalization is below a certain amount. Now, it is your responsibility to stick to that particular mandate. There might be additional objectives and additional constraints, and again, all the constraints and objectives need to be documented and you need to follow them. In terms of addressing unsolicited trade requests, the situation might occur whereby your client asks you to execute a trade or take an investment action that is not consistent with the investment policy. In this situation, what you need to do is try and educate the client or the investor and inform him or her that the proposed action is not compatible with the stated investment policy. You need to make sure that the client understands the risks and the potential rewards before any action is taken. The recommended procedures for compliance are in line with what we've talked about. Obviously, an investment statement policy needs to be put in place, whether the client is an individual investor or an institution. This investment policy statement should be updated on a regular basis because either the client's situation might change over time or the investment environment might change over time. The last point, suitability test procedures, suggests that you as a member or candidate should encourage your firm to conduct routine tests to determine whether investments that are being made for clients are indeed suitable for the client. This would involve going beyond numbers like expected returns and looking at the actual risks and potential risks of investments relative to the stated risk tolerance of your clients. That is it for standard 3C. Now work through the examples. Standard 3D, performance presentation. When communicating investment performance information, members and candidates must make reasonable efforts to ensure that it is fair, accurate, and complete. The guidance is fairly straightforward. Investment managers should provide credible performance information to clients and prospective clients. Avoid misstating performance or misleading clients. If the presentation is brief, make available to clients and prospective clients on request detailed supporting information. In terms of recommended procedures, CFA Institute recommends that investment management firms apply GIPS standards. These standards are covered briefly at level 1 and in detail at level 3. GIPS standards, however, are optional. Firms that do not comply with GIPS should do the following. When presenting performance data to clients, their level of knowledge and sophistication needs to be considered. Investment managers should present the performance of the weighted composite of similar portfolios rather than using a single representative account. Just to illustrate this point, let's say that you are an investment manager and you are managing portfolios for 3 very similar clients, and the 3 portfolios have a similar mandate. One portfolio is worth 2 million, another one is worth 10 million, and the third one is worth 8 million. Let's say that the return on this portfolio was 9%, the return on this one was 20%, and the return on this one was 2%. When you present returns, rather than just take the one portfolio that did really well, you need to present performance based on a weighted average of these 3 similar portfolios. That is what is being referred to here as a composite. You need to include terminated accounts as part of performance history. Say you are reporting performance numbers for the last 5 years, and over the 5 years, some of your clients dropped out, probably because the performance data was not that good. Say you did not do that well for these clients. When you present information, you also need to include these terminated accounts, and you also need to specify when those accounts were terminated. Include disclosures that fully explain the performance results being reported. There might be different methods for calculating returns. In quantitative methods at level 1, you have learned the time-weighted return and the money-weighted return. There might be other methods for calculating return, And when you report numbers, you need to specify which methods you've used. Maintain the data and records used to calculate the performance being presented. This is self-evident. If there is ever an issue, one can go back and look at the records to determine exactly what happened. Standard 3E, preservation of confidentiality. Members and candidates must keep information about current, former, and prospective clients confidential unless one of these three things happens. The information concerns illegal activities on the part of the client, the disclosure is required by law, or the client or prospective client permits disclosure of the information. In terms of guidance, the first point is with regards to the status of the client. If the client is no longer active, in other words, let's say you've lost a client, the information related to the client still needs to be confidential. Compliance with laws, that's already been mentioned here. One can share confidential information as long as it is required by the law. Electronic information and security. A tremendous amount of information is now maintained electronically, and firms need to ensure that processes and procedures are in place such that information is not accidentally shared. A very simple example is where a communication might be happening via email with several clients, and instead of using the BCC feature, the CC or regular feature is used, and in that way the client email addresses which are confidential might be shared with each other. A very simple example, but it illustrates the fact that with a lot of information being shared electronically, firms and members need to be extra careful. Professional conduct investigation by CFA Institute. If a client of yours is being investigated by the professional conduct program, then this particular standard does not necessarily apply, because PCP keeps any confidential information completely to itself. In other words, the PCP can be considered an extension of yourself, and therefore it is okay to share confidential information with PCP. Recommended procedures for compliance. This point illustrates the simple and most conservative approach, which is to avoid disclosing any information received from a client except to authorized fellow employees who are also working for the client. That is the standard procedure unless some of these exceptions apply. That is it in terms of standard 3. This is a very testable standard because of the fact that one of the most important actions for investment advisors and investment managers is to keep the best interest of their clients in mind, and I strongly encourage you to work through all the examples related to duties to clients.